Hello, my dear friends. I'm Grandma Annie and I'm 72 years young, sitting here in my little home in Lakewood, Denver. It's a modest place, but the view of the Rocky Mountains at sunset never fails to take my breath away. These mountains, with their ever-changing colors, are a reminder that life, no matter how difficult, always finds a way to heal. Today, I'm sitting here with a warm cup of tea by my side, gathering the courage to share a story I've kept locked in my heart for many years. It's not an easy story to tell, but it's one I believe needs to be heard. There are too many young women, too many Annies, whose childhoods were stolen from them, and whose voices were silenced by those who should have protected them. But there's something else I want to share with you today. The story I'm about to tell is not just one of suffering and pain. It's a story of survival, resilience, and the power of transformation. I've lived through horrors no child should ever know, and over the years I've learned how to transform that pain into something that could help others. And that's what I want to show you today. It's possible to rebuild your life, no matter how dark or hopeless it may seem. Before we dive into this journey, I want to know where you're watching from. Leave a comment and let me know. It warms my heart to see how far this story reaches and how many lives it touches from across the country and beyond. And if you could give this video a thumbs up, it would mean the world to me. Each one of your likes and subscriptions gives me the strength to keep sharing my story. So let's start, my dear friends. Let me take you back to the Detroit I knew, a city so different from the one we know today. It was a time when streetcars crisscrossed the city, when the Detroit River was still clean enough to swim in, and when Easter Market was the beating heart of the city. This is where my story begins, in a time and place where survival was a daily struggle, but hope was something I would cling to, even when it seemed the most impossible thing. The Detroit I remember from the 1950s was a very different place than what it is today. If you've never been to the old Detroit, it's hard to imagine how much it's changed. Back then, the streets were filled with streetcars rattling along their tracks, weaving in and out of the busy city center. The hum of the city was constant, but there was something about it, a kind of harmony between the industrial pulse of Detroit and the everyday lives of the people who made the city hum. I was just a little girl and the world felt wide and open, filled with possibilities. My father, Arnold, worked at the Easter Market, a sprawling area where people from all walks of life came to shop for fresh produce, meats, and everything in between. It was the heartbeat of Detroit's working class. I remember the colorful stalls, the busy sounds of vendors bargaining, and the smell of fresh bread and fruits filling the air. My father, a strong man with rough hands and a stern face, was a porter at the market. He'd spend his days lifting heavy crates, carrying bags for women doing their shopping, earning his living the hard way, just like so many others in those days. We lived in a small tenement in Corktown, which was an area of Detroit where families struggled but worked hard. The tenements were damp, with peeling wallpaper and cracks in the walls, but they were our home. I remember the sound of the old radiator clanking in the cold winter mornings, the faint smell of the rain that seemed to seep in from the outside. We didn't have much, but we had each other, or at least I thought we did. There was a certain sense of community even in those hard times. People knew each other, and they helped each other out, even if it was just by offering a warm meal or a comforting word. I recall how we would gather at the market, or in the small yards outside our homes, and everyone would chat, exchange stories, and share what they had. It was a world where you learned to make do with what you had and found joy in the small things. The streets were full of life, and there was a sense that we were all in this together, doing what we could to get by. But even in that little world, there were reminders of the divide between those who had and those who didn't. The city was rapidly industrializing, and while there was growth, there was also a stark contrast between the wealthy families in the city's suburbs and the people in neighborhoods like Corktown, where survival meant getting by day. There were times when I would sit on the steps of our tenement, watching the well-dressed men and women pass by in their cars, and I would wonder what it must be like to have a life where you didn't have to worry about the next meal or the next rent payment. And yet, even in those moments of longing, there was a quiet pride in the way we lived. We were hardworking people, resilient and full of hope, even when it seemed the world was stacked against us. I learned early on that a sense of community could be more valuable than money, and that helping others wasn't just about charity, it was about survival. My father, as tough as he was, always looked out for the other people in our building, sharing what little we had when someone was in need. He may have been hardened by life, but there was a part of him that cared deeply, even if he didn't always know how to show it. This world, this version of Detroit, was where I first learned about survival. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but it was life, raw and real. I remember the days when I would go to the market with my father, sitting on a crate next to Mr. John's fruit stand, as he'd sneak me an orange when no one was looking. I didn't fully understand the weight of the world around me then, but I learned to appreciate the little kindnesses, those moments of quiet in a noisy world where someone saw me, even if they didn't know the pain I was hiding inside. But as much as I loved the sounds of Detroit, the markets, and the sense of community, things began to change. The good days, when my father would be sober enough to take me to work with him, sharing those small moments of joy, began to grow fewer and fewer. The harsh realities of life began to weigh on him more heavily, and soon, the rough hands that once carried crates with strength would be shaking from too much whiskey. And that's when everything began to shift. The world I thought I knew, the one full of hope and potential, started to show its cracks. As the years passed, my father's struggles only deepened, and I began to understand more than I ever wanted to about life. The world I thought was a place of warmth and security slowly turned colder and darker. And just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the real change came, taking me to a place I never could have imagined. From the streets of Detroit, where I once felt so small, I was about to be thrust into a much harsher world, one that would test me in ways I never imagined. But in every struggle, in every hardship, I learned something valuable. I learned how to survive. I learned that even in the darkest times, the human spirit is capable of incredible strength. It's strange how some memories stay with you, even when you're so young that you shouldn't remember much at all. For me, the memory of my mother is faint, like a dream I can never quite recall in full. She passed away when I was only 3, and although I can't remember her face with complete clarity, I can still recall the scent of lavender that she always wore. It was the only scent I ever associated with her, and when I close my eyes, I can still catch a whiff of it on the quietest of nights, as if she's still here, visiting me in my dreams. My mother, Irene, was everything to me, even though I barely had time to know her. I was just a little girl when she fell ill, and I watched as she slowly faded away. They say it was tuberculosis. Back then, people didn't get proper diagnoses. They simply got sick and stayed sick until they couldn't hold on any longer. She passed away in our tiny, damp apartment in Corktown, and from that day forward, the world as I knew it changed forever. I don't have many clear memories of her, but I do remember the lullaby she used to sing to me before bed. Her voice was soft, like a whisper, and it was the only thing that could calm me at night when the dark seemed too big for my little room. Sometimes in the stillness of my room now, I can almost hear that song again, as though it's drifting back to me from a time long past. I imagine her, still holding me in her arms, singing the words I can no longer remember. But then, just as quickly as she was there, she was gone, and I was left alone with my father, Arnold. For a long time, I couldn't understand why she had to leave. My father never really talked about her except in passing. He'd say that she was too sick to keep going, and that was the end of it. In a way, he was always distant when it came to her, but I suppose it was his way of coping with the grief. After all, we were both still so young, too young to truly understand what it meant to lose someone so close. The loss of my mother marked the beginning of a different kind of life for me. I never had the chance to feel her love in the way most children do. I never had the experience of running to my mother for comfort after a scraped knee or hearing her voice telling me everything would be okay when I was scared. My world became quieter, emptier. It was just my father and me now in that small, cold apartment in Corktown. I'll admit it was lonely, and I often wondered why things had to be this way. But my father, as hard as he worked, wasn't able to replace the love that a mother would have given. He tried to be a good father in his own way, taking me to work with him at the market, showing me how to carry heavy bags for the women shopping there. At least when we went to the market, I could watch him interact with people, and I could pretend that the world was normal again. But his grief, much like mine, never quite went away. He started drinking to fill the void left by her passing. It wasn't just a little here and there, no, his drinking became a constant in our lives. It started in the morning, a small sip of whiskey to warm up, as he'd say. Then another at lunch to help with digestion. By the time the evening came, my father was often drunk, stumbling into the house after a few more at the bar. And just like that, the loving man who had taken me to the market would become a stranger. His hands, once so gentle when he held me, would now be used to punish me for the smallest mistakes. I learned quickly to read the signs. The way he would rub his chin when he was irritated, the glazed look in his eyes that meant he had drunk too much. I learned to be quiet, to stay out of his way, and to do what I could to keep the peace. But no matter how much I tried to be good, to stay invisible, the reality was that I had inherited not only my mother's features but also her fate, a life full of hardship. I'll never forget the way the neighborhood folks would look at me when we walked together in the market. Poor little thing, no mother, they'd say in whispers, thinking I couldn't hear them. And even though I had no mother to comfort me, I still felt the sting of their words. It was as if my mother's absence was something I couldn't escape, something that defined me in ways I couldn't control. But life, as harsh as it was, never slowed down. I had to grow up fast. School became my only refuge, the only place where I wasn't constantly reminded of the emptiness in my home. I loved school, not because of the lessons, but because it offered me something simple: food, safety, and the chance to just be a kid. I would stay as late as possible just to avoid the long, quiet hours at home, where the echoes of my father's drinking and the silence of my mother's absence haunted every corner. Even though I was young, I understood the impact my mother's death had on our family. I couldn't change the fact that she was gone, but I learned to survive. I found comfort in the small things, like Mr. John slipping me oranges when my father wasn't looking, or the quiet moments I shared with the other children at school. And I dreamed of something better, something beyond the walls of the tenement, something where I could escape the silence that had taken over my world. As the years went by, life became a series of adjustments. But just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the real challenges began. My father's descent into alcoholism escalated, and I found myself at the mercy of forces I could never have anticipated. The next chapter of my life would lead me down paths darker than I could have imagined, yet it would also shape me into someone unbreakable, someone who learned that survival was not just about enduring but about rising up and fighting back. Growing up in Detroit during the 1950s wasn't easy for many of us, especially in neighborhoods like Corktown, where the working-class families struggled daily just to make ends meet. My father and I lived in a small damp tenement, which was little more than a few rooms connected by narrow hallways and crumbling walls. It wasn't a home built for comfort, but it was the only one we had. I remember the creaky stairs, the faint smell of mildew in the air, and how the cold seemed to seep in from every crack in the windows. There was never enough money to go around. We had one bed to share between the two of us, and if it wasn't for the old trunk at the foot of the bed, there wouldn't have been anywhere to store the little we owned. My father worked hard as a porter at the Easter market, but the pay was never enough. We scraped by, but it wasn't a life that offered any luxuries. At the market, my father would carry heavy crates, loading and unloading goods for people who could afford to shop there, while I sat on a crate nearby, watching the world go by. I was grateful for the oranges Mr. John would slip me, and even the few pennies I earned helping out. Small things that kept me going. School was my one real escape. It wasn't just a place to learn, it was where I could eat a warm meal and feel safe for a few hours. The tenement's broken-down heating system never worked right, and when winter came, the cold seemed to settle in our bones. But at school, there were electric lights, a warm room, and something as simple as a lunch that tasted like a little bit of heaven. I wasn't the smartest student by any means, but I always showed up early and stayed late, not just to study but because at school, I didn't have to face the loneliness of our small room, or the anxiety that came with not knowing what the next day would bring. There was always an undercurrent of shame that accompanied poverty. I could feel it every time I heard the whispers of people in the market or when I saw the looks of pity from the teachers at school. Sometimes they'd make comments that stung, even though they didn't mean to. Poor little thing, they'd say when they saw me sitting alone. Or her father's a drunk, I heard when they thought I couldn't hear. Those words, though whispered, were like bricks thrown at me. But it wasn't just the outside world I had to contend with. It was the way poverty seeped into every aspect of our lives. I learned quickly how to make do with the little we had. We didn't have a lot of food, so I would use whatever scraps we had to cook something, even if it was just a pot of potatoes and flour. Sometimes when we couldn't pay the rent, my father would just brush it off and say, "Don't worry, things will work out." But the landlord would always come knocking again, reminding us that things weren't working out. My father's attempts to provide for us became more strained as time went on. I saw him get angrier, drinking more, and that's when the good days, the days when he would take me to the market and share a moment of warmth, became fewer and farther between. On the bad days, his temper would flare up, and he would yell at me, calling me a pest, just like my mother. I remember the sting of his belt across my back and the way it made my skin burn, not just physically but deep in my soul. The same hands that had once held me gently were now the hands that hurt me. I tried to hide it, but the scars were deeper than what anyone could see. Despite everything, I tried to hold on to some sense of hope. At school, I dreamed of a life different from the one I was living. I would imagine having my own little house, a garden full of flowers, and a clean bed to sleep in. But the dreams felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else, a life I couldn't reach, no matter how hard I tried. Even when things seemed hopeless, I kept thinking that education, that simple act of learning, was my way out. It wasn't much, but it was the one thing I could control. The thought that there could be a different life waiting for me was what kept me going. But even as I clung to those small dreams, the reality of our life continued to weigh heavily on me. The world around me seemed to grow darker and more difficult, and I was about to face something I never saw coming. The day we moved to that red house, what would later become known as the Nightflower Inn, was the moment I knew I would never be the same. It wasn't just a new house, it was a new kind of hell, one I wasn't prepared for, even though I had already lived through so much. But in that darkness, I would discover a strength within me that I never knew existed. The real test was just beginning. There are some things that a child can't fully understand until they're older. I was just a little girl when my father's drinking began to take over our lives, but I could feel its presence in every corner of our home, in every interaction between him and me. Looking back, I realized that my father's alcoholism wasn't just a bad habit or a series of bad decisions. It was a silent form of abuse, one that slowly wore away at my sense of safety, leaving behind a trail of hurt that I didn't know how to fix. My father, Arnold, wasn't always a drunk. In the beginning, he was strong, dependable, and even kind. He had a rough exterior, yes, but he also had a tenderness in the way he looked after me when my mother passed away. I can still remember the early days after her death, when it was just the two of us in our cramped, damp apartment. I was his little girl, and in his own way, he tried to be a good father. He would take me with him to the market, sit me on a crate next to the fruit stands while he worked, and sneak me oranges when no one was looking. I thought those moments were special, that he was doing his best, and maybe in his own way he was. But as time went on, things began to change. My father's drinking became a constant in our lives. It started with small drinks of whiskey in the morning, just to ward off the cold, he would say. Then another after lunch to help with digestion. By the time the evening came, he'd be at the bar on Michigan Avenue, drinking his share of whiskey until he could barely stand. There were days when he would come home stumbling, his words slurred, and I knew that the night ahead would be full of tension and unpredictability. At first, I didn't understand it. Why would someone who loved you drink so much? And why would he treat you with such anger and distance after a few drinks? But as the years passed, I learned to read the signs. The way his face would flush when he'd had too much, the glazed look in his eyes that told me he was no longer in control. It wasn't just the alcohol that changed him. It was what came with it. The rage, the yelling, the constant sense of fear that hung in the air whenever he was drunk. I quickly learned to avoid him during those bad days. I would retreat to the corners of our home, hiding in places he couldn't reach, like the cupboard under the stairs or sometimes, if I was lucky, Mrs. Marlene's place across the hall. She'd let me hide there, under her bed, while the storm passed, offering me pieces of bread with lard and kind words that made me feel like I wasn't alone. She was the only person who seemed to see me, really see me, and she would tell me every day, "You've got to study, Annie. That's your way out of here." I did study, but not because I loved learning. It was because at school I didn't have to be in that house, where the smell of whiskey lingered and the fear of what was coming next haunted me. It was a relief to be somewhere else, even if just for a few hours. But school was only a small escape. When I came home, the situation would often be the same. On the bad days, when my father had drunk too much, I would hear the glass bottles breaking, the door slamming, and his voice loud, angry, full of accusations that I didn't deserve. He would say things like, "You're just like your mother, a pest, a burden." And those words cut deeper than I can say. It didn't matter how hard I tried to be good or how hard I worked to stay quiet. It was never enough to stop the violence. The worst part was that I couldn't make sense of it. Why did my father, the man who was supposed to love and protect me, treat me like this? Why did he choose the bottle over me? I couldn't understand that when I was young. I just knew that his love, when it came, was tangled up in whiskey and rage, and I couldn't fix it. No matter how many times I wished he would just stop drinking, it never seemed to happen. It felt like the love I needed was always just out of reach, hidden behind the haze of alcohol and anger. I don't remember the exact moment I realized that my father wasn't just a man who drank too much. I just know that somewhere along the way, I understood that I had to protect myself. I became expert at avoiding him, knowing when to stay out of sight, when to be as quiet as possible so I wouldn't make things worse. But in that silence, in the hiding, I also learned something about survival. I learned how to keep my head down, how to stay invisible when danger was near. Looking back now, I see my father's alcoholism for what it was. A silent form of abuse. It wasn't just the physical beatings or the harsh words. It was the emotional neglect, the constant uncertainty, the fear that lived in our home every time he picked up that bottle. It was the kind of abuse that no one saw, that no one recognized because it didn't leave bruises on my body, but it left scars on my heart, scars that took years to understand. As I grew older, I began to understand more about the world around me. I began to see how poverty, alcohol, and emotional neglect didn't just affect our home. It affected the entire community. And it wasn't just me who was suffering, but what would come next in my life was something I could never have imagined. I was about to be thrust into a world that would test everything I knew about survival. A world where the pain I'd experienced at home would pale in comparison to the horrors I was about to face. But in those darkest moments, I would also discover just how much strength I had within me. When I look back on my childhood, one of the few things that stands out as a constant source of comfort and safety was school. It wasn't just a place where I went to learn. It was my escape, my refuge from the storm that raged at home. Every day, I would wake up with a quiet sense of relief, knowing that for a few precious hours, I wouldn't have to face the chaos of my father's drinking or the harshness of life in our cramped apartment. I could leave behind the noise, the anger, and the fear, and step into a world where things made sense, where there were rules, and where I could simply be a child for a little while. My father never fully understood my need for school. For him, it was just something that was required, a way to keep me occupied during the day. But for me, it was so much more. School was my sanctuary. There, I wasn't the child of a drunk, the girl whose father's rage hung over her like a dark cloud. At school, I could be just Annie, a young girl who had dreams and hopes for a future that felt just a little bit out of reach. I remember the school I attended as a child. It wasn't fancy by any means. It was an old building with worn-out floors and crowded classrooms, but it was mine. It was the place where I first learned that I could make something of myself if I worked hard enough. The teachers there, especially Mrs. Cecilia, took notice of me. I wasn't the smartest in the class, but I was always the first one to arrive and the last one to leave. Not because I loved learning, it wasn't always about the lessons for me, but because at school, I didn't have to worry about my father's unpredictable moods or the tension that filled our small apartment. School gave me structure, a sense of normalcy. There was something about the routine of school that made everything feel safer. The bell ringing to start the day, the hum of the classroom as everyone sat down to work. It was a steady rhythm, like the comforting sound of a heartbeat. And it was in that structure that I found a way to survive. I learned early on that if I worked hard enough, I could make school my escape, even if it was just for a few hours each day. I could lose myself in my books and my assignments, letting the world around me fall away, if only for a while. But there was more to it than just escaping. At school, I learned that I could be more than the sum of my circumstances. I had teachers who noticed me, who saw potential in me, even when I couldn't see it in myself. Mrs. Cecilia, in particular, would often pull me aside after class and tell me that I had a future. "This girl has a future," I overheard her telling the other teachers once, as she looked at my worn-out notebook patched together with tape. It wasn't just the compliment that made me feel special. It was the fact that she believed in me when no one else did. One of the most meaningful things she did for me was give me a new notebook when mine was falling apart. To some, it might seem like a small gesture, but to me it was a sign that someone cared, that someone was paying attention. I hadn't realized how badly I needed that kind of attention until it was given to me. It was the first real gift I remember receiving. Not something that could be bought or sold, but something that showed me that I mattered. But even as I thrived at school, I couldn't escape the reality of my home life. My father's drinking worsened, and the violence became more frequent. The good days, when he'd take me to the market or we'd have dinner together, became fewer and fewer. The bad days, when I could sense his anger building before he even stepped through the door, became more common. But in those days, when I knew it was going to be hard, I would lean on my schoolwork for support. I would focus on my assignments, throw myself into reading, or daydream about the life I wanted to build for myself someday. School was where I learned that there were possibilities beyond the tenement, beyond the small room we shared. I didn't know exactly what my future would look like, but I knew that education was the key to something better. I remember dreaming about becoming a teacher like Mrs. Cecilia. I wanted to have a classroom to help other children learn the way she helped me. Or maybe I'd be a nurse helping others in a different way. I imagined a life where I wasn't defined by the struggles of my childhood, a life where I could be proud of what I had built with my own hands, free from the weight of poverty and fear. And so day after day I worked. I studied harder than I ever thought possible, not because I was the best student, but because I needed something to hold on to, something to believe in. I knew that education was my ticket out, and I wasn't going to let my circumstances define my future. But as much as school offered me an escape, it wasn't the only place where I would find my strength. Just as I began to hope that things might change, life threw me another curveball, one that would test everything I had learned and everything I had worked for. And that test would come in the form of a place I could never have imagined. A place that would shake me to my core but also show me just how much resilience I had within me. Sometimes the smallest things can bring the most comfort in the hardest of times. For me, that small source of comfort came in the form of a stray cat, a cat I named Whiskers. He was nothing special, just a thin, scrappy little thing with gray fur and a cautious look in his eyes, but to me, he was everything. In a life filled with uncertainty, pain, and the unpredictability of my father's alcoholism, Whiskers became a steady companion, offering the one thing I longed for most: unconditional love. It all started when I was about 10. Our lives had settled into a precarious routine by then, one marked by my father's unpredictable temper and his increasing reliance on alcohol. After my mother passed, it was just the two of us in the tiny tenement we called home. There were days when my father would take me to work with him at the market, but those days were becoming less frequent. He'd drink more and more, sometimes starting with a sip of whiskey before breakfast to warm up, as he liked to say. On the worst days, when the house was filled with tension and the air thick with the smell of whiskey, I would retreat into my own world, dreaming of escape. I wasn't a fool. I knew that my father was slowly slipping further into his addiction and that I was left to fend for myself more often than not. So one day, when I noticed Whiskers skinny, frightened, and barely old enough to fend for himself, wandering around the back alley of our building, I did what any lonely, neglected child would do. I took him in. At first, I hid him from my father. He never liked animals, especially stray ones, believing they were just another mouth to feed. But Whiskers wasn't like other animals. He didn't demand much, just a bit of food, a little bit of affection, and a place to sleep. In return, he gave me a kind of quiet companionship that I had never known before. On days when my father was particularly bad, when his anger seemed like a storm that would never pass, I would slip into the small, dark corner of the apartment where Whiskers liked to curl up, and I'd stroke his soft fur. In those moments, the world would feel just a little bit less overwhelming. Whiskers wasn't just a pet. He was a friend, a confidant. Whenever I felt afraid or alone, I'd talk to him about my dreams, about how I longed for a life beyond the confines of the tenement, how I wished for a clean house with flowery curtains and a garden, a place where no one would yell at me or hit me. Whiskers would just look at me with those big, soft eyes as if to say, "I understand." I'd scratch behind his ears, and for that brief moment, everything would feel okay. It was amazing how such a small creature could bring so much solace. I'd never experienced unconditional love like that before, not from my father, not from anyone. Whiskers didn't care that I was poor, that I lived in a rundown apartment with peeling wallpaper and broken windows. He didn't care that my father had a temper or that I often went to bed hungry. Whiskers just cared that I showed up, that I fed him, that I gave him attention when I could. And in return, he gave me something even more precious than companionship. He gave me a sense of worth. He made me feel like I wasn't invisible, like I mattered to someone. But of course, my father eventually found out. He hated animals, and Whiskers was no exception. At first, he scolded me for keeping a cat in our small home, claiming it was just one more mouth to feed, one more thing I was trying to sneak past him. But when he saw how much comfort Whiskers brought me, how I'd spend hours talking to him, something in my father's hardened heart seemed to soften. Perhaps it was because Whiskers made me happy, or perhaps because, deep down, he knew he wasn't able to provide the kind of comfort I needed. Whatever it was, he begrudgingly allowed me to keep the cat, even though he never fully accepted him into our lives. Despite my father's bitterness, I found peace in my little corner with Whiskers. I would sit with him at night, when my father had passed out from drinking too much, and I would tell him all my hopes and dreams. I knew it was silly, talking to a cat about wanting to be a teacher or a nurse, wanting to escape the chaos of my life, but it was all I had. And in those moments, Whiskers would purr contentedly, his soft body curled in my lap. And I would believe that someday, somehow, I might just escape the life I had been born into. But even as Whiskers gave me a small taste of love, the reality of my situation was becoming more and more difficult to ignore. My father's alcoholism continued to deepen, and as he fell further into his addiction, I found myself becoming more and more afraid of what was to come. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I was about to face a new kind of challenge, one that would shake me to my core. But what I didn't realize then was that it would also be the beginning of a journey that would lead me to a new kind of freedom, a new kind of strength, and a way to change my life forever. It's strange how one decision, one change in your life, can alter everything forever. If I had known then, when my father told me we were moving to the Nightflower Inn, what awaited me on the other side of that door, I might have run far away. But I didn't know. I was just a scared 11-year-old girl, hungry and cold, who thought moving to a new place meant having food on the table every day. Little did I know, I was about to walk into the darkest chapter of my life, a place where innocence and hope would be taken from me, where my world would shift in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. The day we moved felt different, heavier somehow. My father wasn't his usual self. There was an odd excitement in his voice, a nervous energy that sent shivers down my spine. He'd been drinking again, and his words were slurred as he told me we were going to a new place, a better place. When he said it, I didn't feel reassured. Instead, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. There was something about the way he smiled, the way his eyes glittered with anticipation, that made me uneasy. But I was young and I had no choice. I was still clinging to the hope that things could improve, that this was the start of something better. After all, we were leaving behind the tenement, the cold, and the constant fear. We took a bus to the north end of Detroit, away from the heart of the city. The streets became darker, the air thicker with the scent of the industrial factories and the heavy smoke that billowed from the chimneys. The neighborhood was a far cry from the busy, bustling streets of downtown Detroit. It was quieter, more isolated. I felt a pang of fear as we walked past boarded-up windows and houses that looked as if they hadn't seen a coat of paint in decades. There were no children playing in the streets, no families walking together. Instead, the streets were filled with men in dirty coats and women with too much lipstick, standing on corners or walking in and out of dark buildings. When we reached the house, a faded red building with an old wooden sign that read, Nightflower Inn, I felt my heart skip a beat. The smell of cheap perfume and cigarette smoke hit me before I even stepped through the door. My father pushed open the rusty gate, which creaked as if protesting the weight of the world, and led me inside. This is it, he said, as if it were something to be proud of. My eyes scanned the dim interior, taking in the dusty curtains, the faded wallpaper, and the strange pictures of half-naked women that lined the walls. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. The place felt wrong, like stepping into a world that didn't belong to me. But what could I do? I was just a girl, and I didn't have anywhere else to go. My father, drunk and grinning, led me upstairs to a small room where I would share a bed with two other girls, Sonia and Dora, who were already fast asleep. Their beds were unmade, their faces turned away from me, but I could see the purple bruises peeking from beneath the blankets. The room was small and suffocating, with peeling walls and a stale smell that made my stomach turn. Carmen, the woman who ran the place, showed me where I was supposed to sleep and told me not to make any noise. She didn't look at me with kindness, but with the kind of appraisal one might give a new product. She inspected me as if I were some commodity to be sold or used, her eyes lingering on my small, still childish body. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just entered a world where I didn't belong, where I wasn't wanted, and yet, somehow, I was expected to fit in. From that moment, my life became a blur of harsh realities. During the day, I cleaned the house, scrubbing floors, washing stained sheets, and preparing food for the clients who would arrive in the evening. I no longer attended school, as my father said I didn't need an education anymore. You've got a trade now, he would say, as if he were proud of what he had done, as if he had somehow made my life better by bringing me to that place. But I knew better. I knew that nothing good could come from this. The women in the house, the ones who worked there, treated me with a mixture of pity and indifference. Some, like Sonia, were kind. She'd share her candy with me or let me read her books. But most of them were lost in their own struggles, addicted to alcohol or drugs, simply trying to survive in a world that had forgotten about them. It didn't take long for me to realize that I wasn't just in a brothel, I was living in a place where hope had died a long time ago. Carmen, the manager, kept a close eye on everyone. She was always watching, always making sure nothing slipped by her. She was the one who ensured that the girls were kept in line and that the clients were satisfied. My father, in his drunken stupor, was more of a bystander, collecting the money that came in and turning a blind eye to everything else. He had already sold me to this life, and now he didn't have to worry about me anymore. His job was done as far as he was concerned. For months, I did the same thing every day, cleaning, cooking, and watching as men came and went, using the women like they were nothing more than objects. I tried not to see it, tried not to feel it, but the reality was that I was becoming numb to everything around me. But even in the darkest corners of that life, a small spark of hope remained inside me. I had learned from Mrs. Marlene, the kind neighbor from our old building, that education was the key to escape. And somehow, despite everything, I still held on to that belief. I knew that as long as I was alive, as long as I could still dream, there was a chance that things could get better. I just had to survive long enough to see it happen. But I was about to face another challenge that would push me to the brink of despair, and in that moment, I would discover the true depth of my strength and determination. At the age of 12, I came face to face with the brutal truth about my new reality at the Nightflower Inn. It was the first time I fully understood the depth of my father's betrayal and the horrifying path that had been set for me, one I would not be able to turn away from, at least not without risking everything. I had tried to convince myself that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. After all, my father had promised that things would be better here. There would be food on the table, a roof over our heads, and maybe even a chance for me to escape the hardship of our past. But as the days wore on, I realized that the better life he promised came with a heavy price, one I wasn't ready to pay. One morning, shortly after I had moved in, my father came into the small room where I was preparing breakfast. His steps were unsteady, and the smell of whiskey clung to him like a second skin. He sat on the edge of the bed, a cigarette dangling from his fingers, his face shadowed with a sense of purpose I hadn't seen before. I remember looking at him, trying to read his expression, trying to understand what was going through his mind. "It's time," he said in a tone that was more cold than caring. "You need to start paying your way, just like the other girls here." His words struck me like a slap in the face. I froze for a moment, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. My heart raced. "Pay my way?" I asked, barely able to form the words. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a long drag from his cigarette, blew out the smoke, and stared at the floor. "You've been eating here for free. You've been living here for free. It's time for you to do your part." I knew in that instant that something terrible was coming. My mind raced back to all the stories I had heard from the girls at the inn, stories I tried to block out, stories about the men who came in and out of this place like it was their personal playground. But I was still too young, too naive, to fully grasp what it meant to do my part. It wasn't until later that afternoon when Carmen, who ran the house with an iron fist, came to me with a cold, calculating smile, that the reality of what my father had planned for me hit me like a freight train. She handed me a thin white nightgown, far too small for my body, and told me that I was to wear it for the clients. I would be working that night. As Carmen dressed me in that gown, I could barely hold back the tears. I knew deep down that there was no escaping this. This was the moment I realized that the life I had dreamed about, of running away, of finding a way out, was slipping through my fingers. I was trapped. The door I had walked through so many months ago had slammed shut behind me, and now it felt like there was no way out. Carmen's words echoed in my head as she looked me over with a cold, appraising gaze. "Don't fight it," she said, her voice sharp and unfeeling. "You'll learn. It's not so bad. It's just a job. And it pays well." The tears I had been holding back spilled over, but there was no comfort in them. I felt numb. I wanted to scream, to run, to break free, but I knew I couldn't. I had nowhere to go. My father had delivered me to this place, and I had no way of fighting back. He was the one who had sold me into this life, and no one cared enough to stop it. That night, as I stood in the hallway of the Nightflower Inn, waiting for the first client, I felt as though I had already died. The young girl who dreamed of becoming a teacher, of escaping the pain, was gone. In her place stood a broken version of myself, someone who had lost everything, her innocence, her dreams, and most tragically, her sense of self-worth. I wasn't even a person anymore. I was just an object, an instrument to be used. But even in that moment of utter despair, I found something inside me that I didn't know existed. A small, flickering ember of defiance. I didn't know how or when I would escape this nightmare, but I knew I had to survive. I had to hold on to whatever part of myself hadn't been crushed yet. I wasn't going to let this be the end of my story. As the days passed, I learned the rules of the Nightflower Inn, the unspoken rules that governed the lives of the girls who lived and worked there. I learned how to blend into the shadows, to be invisible when I needed to be. But there was something about that ember of defiance that kept burning inside me, something that whispered that there was still a chance for me to escape. I didn't know how or when it would happen, but I knew that the path to freedom wouldn't be easy. And yet, every day, I became a little stronger, a little more determined to find a way out of the darkness that threatened to consume me. The road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but I was no longer the helpless girl who had walked through that door. I was someone who had survived, and in that survival, I would find my way forward. Life at the Nightflower Inn became a grueling routine, one that I had no choice but to accept, despite the overwhelming weight it placed on my shoulders. Every day bled into the next, and I began to lose track of time, weeks, months, maybe even years. In the beginning, I kept telling myself that I just had to survive. If I could make it through one more night, one more day, I might find a way to escape. But as the years went by, it became harder and harder to remember what freedom felt like. At first, I wasn't required to do the same things as the other women. I was still considered a new girl, so my role in the house was confined to cleaning, preparing meals, and doing the odd jobs that needed to be done. I scrubbed floors until my hands bled, washed sheets stained with the remnants of someone else's work, and cooked meals for the men who came and went, their faces often blurred in my memory. I learned how to be invisible, quiet, efficient, and quick. I did my job without complaint, not because I wanted to, but because it was the only way to avoid drawing attention to myself. In those early days, I kept a little part of myself hidden away, trying desperately to protect the girl who used to dream of a better life. That girl had been there in the quiet moments before the night flower and swallowed her whole. But she was slipping away. Slowly, the brutality of what I had to endure took away pieces of her. The sting of my father's betrayal, the way he'd sold me to this life, and the cruel routine that followed, it all became a part of me, like the suffocating air I breathed in that house. The men came at night, their faces twisted with greed or alcohol, their eyes dull with desire. They treated me like an object, an item to be used and discarded, and for so long I accepted it. It was the only way to survive. On the good nights, the nights when I didn't have to do more than smile and sit beside them, I could pretend for a moment that I wasn't trapped in this hell. But those moments were few and far between. Carmen, the manager of the brothel, was the one who ran the show. She had a cold, calculating way about her. She saw everything and heard everything. Nothing happened without her knowledge, and everything was done for profit. She was harsh but practical. You work here, you do what you're told, and you don't complain, she would tell us, her voice hard as stone. Her words weren't just rules, they were commands that we had no choice but to follow. She kept a watchful eye on the girls, ensuring that we did our job as expected, and she often reminded us how lucky we were to have a place to stay, food to eat. My father, ever drunk and disconnected, was little more than a figurehead in the house. He collected the money from the clients, spent it on his next drink, and never looked back. He was just a man who had abandoned his daughter for the promise of easy money. The worst nights were when the men didn't just come for the usual transaction, they came for control. They came to break us, to assert their power over our bodies. It wasn't just about sex, it was about subjugation, about humiliation. I remember on more than one occasion feeling utterly helpless, as if I were no more than a piece of furniture, just something to be used and thrown away. And in those moments I found myself wondering if I would ever be free, if I would ever escape the nightmare that had become my reality. The women who lived there, the ones who worked alongside me, were no strangers to abuse either. Some had been there for years, trapped in cycles of addiction, despair, and violence. Others, like me, had been brought in by circumstances beyond their control, desperate parents, abusive boyfriends, or just the cruel twists of fate that had left them with no other options. Some of the women were kind to me. Sonia, one of the girls I shared a room with, would occasionally slip me a candy bar or lend me a book. She would tell me stories of a better life, one where we could escape together, but we both knew it was a dream that was unlikely to come true. Most of the women, though, were too lost in their own pain to offer much comfort. They were just trying to survive, to get by, to make it through the day. They smoked cigarettes to numb the pain, popped pills to get through the night, and drank away the memories of better days long past. I became used to the sounds of their soft sobs at night, the muffled cries that came from behind the closed doors of their rooms. But there was no comfort to be found in this world. We were all in it together, but we were all so alone. The nights were long. The lights always seemed to be dim, the rooms always too quiet, even when they were filled with people. But there were moments, small moments, when I could slip away from it all. I'd go to the back kitchen, where I could escape for just a little while, where the smell of food and the clink of dishes felt like a lifeline. Those moments didn't last long, but they were enough to remind me that I was still human. That I wasn't just a thing, just an object to be discarded. Still, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the girl I had been was slowly fading away. I was no longer the hopeful child who had dreamed of becoming a teacher. I wasn't even sure what I wanted anymore. I had learned to keep my head down, to avoid drawing attention, to do what was asked of me and nothing more. But even in the deepest, darkest corners of the Nightflower Inn, I still held on to something, hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Because deep down, I knew that there had to be something more to life than this. There had to be a way out. I didn't know when it would come or how it would come, but I knew that I wouldn't let the darkness swallow me whole. I would survive. Somehow. But even as I clung to that hope, the path to freedom seemed impossible. Life at the Nightflower Inn had become a cycle of despair, a relentless routine that never seemed to end. But little did I know things were about to change. There would come a time when the darkest days of my life would give way to the chance for a new beginning, one that would offer a glimmer of light, and maybe, just maybe, a way out. In the midst of my painful existence at the Nightflower Inn, where every day seemed like a struggle just to hold on to my fading humanity, I met someone who would become my unexpected source of light. His name was Jeremy, and he wasn't like the other men who came through the door. There was something different about him, something that made him stand out amidst the darkness of the world I was trapped in. Jeremy worked as a delivery man, bringing boxes of beer and whiskey to the brothel. He was a young man, just a few years older than me, with kind eyes and a quiet manner. I had seen him before, making his rounds, but we had never really spoken. He was just another face in the crowd, another person passing through the grim reality of the place I called home. But everything changed the first time he looked at me as more than just a product to be sold. One afternoon, I was cleaning the kitchen when Jeremy walked in, carrying a heavy box of supplies. He paused when he saw me, wiping my hands on a dish towel, and for a moment, we just stood there, looking at each other. He smiled, a simple, genuine smile that didn't make my stomach twist in fear or discomfort like the others did. It was a smile that felt kind, even hopeful. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "You're the girl who's always cleaning around here, right?" I nodded, a little surprised by his attention, but grateful for it at the same time. "Yeah, that's me," I replied quietly, not really knowing what to say. "I'm Jeremy," he introduced himself, setting the box down. "I've seen you working here a lot. How long have you been doing this?" I hesitated. His question, innocent as it was, struck a chord deep inside me. How long had I been doing this? It felt like a lifetime, but in reality it had been just a few years. It felt impossible to think of it that way, but it was the truth. "A while," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, his gaze softening. "I've noticed you don't talk much to anyone here," he said. "I just wanted to let you know, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm around." It was a small thing, just a casual remark, but to me it was the first sign of kindness I had received in years. No one had ever bothered to ask me how I was doing, how I was feeling, not in any real way. Most people in that place saw me as nothing more than part of the furniture, something to be used and discarded. But Jeremy didn't look at me that way. His kindness was like a balm to a wound I didn't even know was still open. Over the next few weeks, we started talking more often whenever he'd come in to drop off supplies. Sometimes it was about something simple, like the weather, or the odd assortment of characters that frequented the brothel. But sometimes Jeremy would look at me and ask about my life, not just the surface details, but the things that mattered. He asked about my dreams, about what I wanted for the future. It was the first time anyone had taken an interest in my thoughts and feelings. I always wanted to be a teacher. I told him one day, sitting on the small bench in the back kitchen peeling potatoes. I wanted to help kids, teach them to read and write. I imagined a life where I could actually make a difference. Jeremy looked at me with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. "You can still do that," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "You're strong. You've got the heart for it." I didn't know how to respond to him. It felt impossible to think of a future like that. I had been so focused on surviving day to day that I couldn't imagine a life beyond the walls of the Nightflower Inn. But when Jeremy said those words, something inside me stirred. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was still a chance to build something for myself, something beyond the world I had been born into. Despite my circumstances, Jeremy treated me with respect. It wasn't just because he saw me as a person. He saw me as someone who deserved more than this life. And though I still wasn't sure what hope felt like, his presence gave me a glimmer of it. We'd talk late into the night when the house was quiet, sharing dreams, fears, and quiet laughs. He never once touched me inappropriately, never once treated me like an object. With Jeremy, I was just Annie, a girl who had been through far too much, but still held on to a shred of humanity. Times it felt almost surreal. I wasn't used to kindness, certainly not from men, not from anyone in my life before him. But Jeremy's kindness, the simple way he smiled at me or listened to me talk about my old dreams, reminded me of the girl I once was, the girl who used to believe in a better life. He gave me something that I hadn't had in so long, a sense of worth. I began to look forward to his visits, even though I knew they were fleeting. He wasn't around much, and I knew that the life I led was still so different from his. But in those moments when we were together, it was as if the weight of the world lifted, even if only for a little while. And with him I felt like I mattered. One night, as I was cleaning the back room, Jeremy came to find me, his usual smile replaced by something more serious. "Annie," he said, his voice lower than usual, "I know you're going through a lot, and I can't promise I can fix everything. But I want you to know something. Whatever happens, you don't have to do this forever. You have a future. You deserve better." I nodded, but I wasn't sure I believed him. Still, his words echoed in my heart, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine the possibility of something better. But as much as Jeremy's kindness gave me hope, the reality of my situation remained. I couldn't escape the brothel, not yet anyway. My father still controlled my life, and even if Jeremy had shown me the light at the end of the tunnel, I still had a long way to go. Yet, with every conversation I had with him, I began to feel stronger, more capable of breaking free. It was going to take time, but I knew now that I wasn't completely alone. And that knowledge, that tiny spark of hope, would eventually lead me to the most important decision of my life, the decision to fight back. There comes a time in every person's life, even in the darkest of places, when the weight of your circumstances becomes too much to bear. It's a moment when you realize that survival alone is no longer enough, that you deserve more than the life you've been handed. For me, that moment came one quiet evening in the Nightflower Inn, when I finally decided that I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to escape. The idea of escape had been brewing in my mind for a while, like a distant dream I could never quite reach. It was a thought that came and went, fleeting and fragile, as I lived day by day, trapped in a cycle of abuse and isolation. But Jeremy, he was the one who gave me the courage to consider it seriously. He was the one who showed me that there was, in fact, a life beyond the walls of that horrible place, a life I could still have if I dared to dream of it. It was Jeremy who reminded me that I was worth something, that my life wasn't meant to be defined by the horror I had endured. I remember the night I made the decision. It was a cold, gray evening, and I was in the back kitchen peeling potatoes. Another day, another monotonous task. I'd been working in the brothel for years now, long enough to lose count of the men who had passed through my life, long enough for my body to feel the weight of the abuse. But that night something shifted. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't let this be my life. I was 17, and I knew that if I didn't escape now, I would be trapped here forever. The thought of spending the rest of my life in this hellhole, watching the same men doing the same work, living in constant fear, was too much. So I made a plan. I didn't know exactly how it would work, or when it would happen, but I knew that I had to act. I started small, hidden in the quiet corners of the inn where no one could see me. I saved money, just a little here and there, by stashing tips in the lining of my coat. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jeremy had given me a small taste of hope, and now I needed to hold on to it with everything I had. I also started listening more closely to the conversations that took place at the inn. I paid attention to every detail: names, dates, the men who came and went, the locations of secret meetings. My father, always drunk, would often talk openly in front of me, never realizing I was paying attention. I memorized everything, storing the information away in my mind like a secret weapon. It was risky, but I knew I had to be prepared. The more I thought about escape, the more the pieces began to fall into place. I couldn't do it alone. I had no documents, no identification, and no money. But Jeremy, he could help. He had already shown me kindness when no one else would. He had been the first person to treat me like I mattered. I knew I could trust him, and together we might have a chance. Jeremy and I began to meet in secret, away from the prying eyes of the other girls and Carmen. In the quiet moments when the inn was still, we'd talk about what needed to be done. He had saved up money from his delivery job, and together we started to piece together a plan. We discussed fake identification, how to get out of Detroit without being recognized, and where we could go. It was dangerous, so many things could go wrong, but it was our only chance. I could feel my fear rising, the terror of what might happen if my father or Carmen found out. But at the same time, I felt a strange sense of peace. This was the first time in years that I had a sense of control, the first time I had a plan for my future instead of just drifting along in survival mode. The hardest part, the part that kept me awake at night, was knowing that I might have to leave the other girls behind. Some had become my friends, even if they were hardened by years of abuse. Sonia, Dora, and the others, they had been through so much, and I knew that they would never have the chance to leave. Their lives were too entwined with the brothel, but I couldn't save them all, I realized. I had to save myself first. I remember the night Jeremy and I agreed on the final details. It was late and the inn was quiet. He kissed my forehead gently, as if to say goodbye to the person I used to be. "We'll make it, Annie," he whispered. "You won't be trapped here forever. You're stronger than you know." I didn't say anything in return. What could I say? The only thing I knew for sure was that this escape was my chance at freedom, and I wasn't going to let anyone, stand in my way. The next few days passed in a blur. I continued working, pretending everything was normal, but in the back of my mind, I was already planning my escape. I knew the risks, but I also knew that the moment I stepped out of that door, I would be walking into a new life, a life I was going to build from scratch. But before that could happen, I had one last hurdle to face: my father. I didn't know how he would react to my disappearance, or what kind of hell he would unleash in response. But I had made up my mind. I was ready. The night of my escape would be the night everything changed. It would be the night I took back my life. It's strange how life has a way of throwing you into situations that you can never predict, situations that test your strength, your survival instinct, and sometimes even your very will to live. For me, that moment came on the night of a fire. A tragedy that would change everything. A night that, despite the devastation, offered me the freedom I had longed for but never thought would come. The night began like any other. The brothel was busy, and I was in the kitchen, preparing meals for the clients who would soon arrive. The smells of greasy food filled the air, mixing with the familiar, sickly scent of stale alcohol that seemed to hang around the house like a permanent fixture. I tried to keep my head down, focusing on my work and trying not to think too much about the life I was living. But even on the most ordinary of nights, something always seemed to be lurking around the corner, waiting to disrupt the fragile normalcy I had come to accept. I remember hearing the commotion downstairs first, the loud voices, the angry shouting. My heart sank when I recognized the voices of my father and Congressman Myers, the man who had caused me so much pain, the man who had owned me for far too long. It wasn't unusual for them to argue, but this time, the anger in their voices was different, sharper, more dangerous. I didn't know it then, but it would be the last time I would hear either of their voices again. I rushed to the top of the stairs to see what was happening, but before I could make it down, I heard the unmistakable sound of gunshots. 3 shots followed by the horrific sound of my father's body hitting the floor. The chaos that followed was like a nightmare coming to life: screams, shouts, and the panicked rush of footsteps. My pulse raced as fear gripped my chest. My body froze for a moment, paralyzed by the sound of those shots, knowing full well what they meant. Then the fire started. It happened so quickly, I barely had time to process it. One of the bullets had struck an oil lamp, knocking it to the floor, where it shattered and ignited the dry wooden walls. In a matter of seconds, the whole house was engulfed in flames, the heat so intense I could feel it from where I stood. Smoke filled the air, thick and suffocating, as the fire spread rapidly, consuming everything in its path. I ran to the window, desperate to escape, but the second floor was too high, and the smoke was so thick I could barely see. I turned, searching for a way out, but the building seemed to be collapsing around me. It was as if the fire had come from nowhere, swallowing the house whole. That's when I saw him. Congressman Myers, his face twisted with rage and fear, stumbling through the smoke, his gun still in hand. His eyes met mine, and I saw something cold, something lethal in them. He was coming for me. Without thinking, I ran. I grabbed my coat, the one I had secretly been stuffing with money and scraps of paper in preparation for my escape. My heart pounded in my chest as I broke the window, the glass shattering around me. The pain of the fall was sharp, but I barely felt it as I tumbled down onto the roof of the storage shed below. I could hear the fire behind me, crackling and roaring as the house burned. The smoke was thick in the air, but I didn't stop. I knew if I hesitated for even a second, I might not make it out. I didn't look back as I slid down the roof and hit the alley below, but I could hear the fire trucks approaching, the sirens screaming into the night. Jeremy was waiting for me, just like we had planned. He didn't ask questions, didn't try to understand what had just happened. He helped me to my feet, supporting me as I limped through the darkness, away from the flames, away from the place that had been my prison for so long. As we ran through the streets of Detroit, I could hear the crackling of the fire behind us, the sounds of destruction and death. My father, my cruel alcoholic father, was gone, and with him, the life I had known. Myers, too, was lost in the chaos. The Nightflower Inn, the place where I had been trapped for so long, was now nothing but a pile of burning rubble. The horror of that place, the memories of all the pain and abuse, were now consumed by the flames. It felt like the world had come crashing down, and yet, for the first time in years, I felt free. The fire had taken everything from me, but in its wake, it had given me something I had never thought possible: a chance to escape. A chance to start over. But even though I was free, the road ahead was not without its challenges. The fire had changed everything, but it had also left scars, both physical and emotional, that would take years to heal. As Jeremy and I fled the streets of Detroit that night, I knew that I had taken the first step toward rebuilding my life. But I also knew that the journey ahead would be long and difficult. Still, I was no longer the girl who had walked into the Nightflower in all those years ago. I was someone new, someone who had survived. And with Jeremy by my side, I felt stronger than I had ever been before. The night we escaped from the fire, everything changed. The familiar streets of Detroit felt different as we ran through them, our footsteps echoing in the dark. Jeremy, always calm and steady, kept close to me, his hand on my arm, guiding me through the chaos. I had just left behind the world that had confined me for so long, the brothel, the pain, the fear. But now in the cold night air, there was something else: freedom. I didn't know where we were going, but I trusted Jeremy. We had no plan, no destination, but at that moment, we had something even more powerful: a shared will to survive. We didn't talk much as we ran. The only sound between us was the steady beat of our footsteps, the occasional rustling of leaves in the empty streets, and the distant wail of sirens heading toward the inferno we had left behind. We finally arrived at a small boarding house in the Rivertown district. The building wasn't much, old, with peeling paint and windows that had seen better days, but it was a safe place. At least, for now, it was safe. Mrs. Judith, the elderly woman who owned the boarding house, didn't ask many questions when we knocked on her door. She saw the fear in our eyes and the disarray in our appearance, me with my hair tangled, my clothes still dirty from the fire, and Jeremy, his face pale with the weight of what we had just fled. "You two look too scared to be just looking for a place to sleep," she said with a knowing look. "Come in. I don't ask too many questions around here. Just pay in advance and I'll give you a room." Her words were simple, but they were exactly what I needed to hear. She didn't judge us, didn't question where we had come from. She just offered us a place to rest. For the first time in years, I felt like I was allowed to be human again. The room she gave us was small, just enough space for a mattress on the floor and a single chair, but it was clean. There was warmth, and for the first time in my life, there was no sense of imminent danger lurking around every corner. We were safe, even if just for a little while. Jeremy and I didn't have much, but we managed to settle in. I started cleaning the room, setting things in order, even though we didn't have much to work with. It felt good to have a space of our own, even if it was temporary. We would cook our meals on a small hot plate, wash our clothes in the shared bathroom sink, and spend our days just trying to rebuild from the rubble of our past. In those early days, I didn't sleep much. The memories of the fire, of the girls I had left behind, haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flames consuming the Nightflower Inn, and I heard the desperate screams of the women I had known, the ones I could never save. I carried the weight of their silence with me, as if their pain had become part of me. But each day, as Jeremy and I slowly built our new life, I began to realize that I had a chance to heal. I had a chance to be something more than just a survivor. I started to read again, something I hadn't done in years. Jeremy had given me books over the years, but I had never had the time or the space to truly absorb them. Now, in the quiet of the boarding house, I read everything I could get my hands on. I devoured stories of brave women, of people who overcame the odds, and of those who, despite everything, still found a way to build something beautiful from their pain. One day, as I was reading The Little Prince, a book Jeremy had given me just before we escaped, I had an epiphany. The words about the rose, about how what is essential is invisible to the eye, struck me deeply. For so long, I had been trying to survive in a world that had robbed me of everything that was essential. But now I realized I could rebuild. I could take the lessons I had learned in those dark years and transform them into something meaningful. The pain didn't go away, of course. There were still nights when the nightmares came, when I woke up covered in sweat, my heart racing. But during the day and the quiet moments, I felt the first stirrings of hope. The idea of a future, of something better, no longer felt like a distant dream. It felt like a real possibility. I began to think about what I wanted to do next. The idea of continuing my education, of becoming something more than just a girl who had been broken by life, started to take root in my mind. I didn't know how I would get there, but I knew I couldn't keep hiding forever. I had to find a way to make something of my life, something that would honor the person I had been before the fire, before the brothel, before all the abuse. But as I looked toward the future, I knew that the path I had to walk wouldn't be easy. It would be filled with challenges, with setbacks, and with more pain. But I also knew that I wasn't the same person I had been when I entered the Nightflower Inn. I had survived, and in that survival I had found something stronger than fear, resilience. Now with Jeremy by my side, I was ready to face whatever came next. Our new life had begun, and I was determined to make it count. After my escape from the brothel, I often found myself reflecting on the years I had spent trapped in a world where the justice system had failed me, and where it continued to fail the countless others who suffered like I did. The pain of my past wasn't just from the physical abuse I endured, it was also from the realization that those who had harmed me, those who had stolen my childhood, had never truly faced any consequences for their actions. The system that was meant to protect people like me had turned a blind eye, choosing instead to protect those with power and influence. I knew deep down that if I was ever going to truly heal, if I was going to make sure others never had to suffer like I did, I had to do something about it. I had to fight for accountability. At first, I didn't know where to begin. I had no formal education, no documents to prove my identity or my past, and the thought of confronting the people who had controlled my life for so long was terrifying. But Jeremy, my steadfast companion through everything, believed in me. He didn't just give me hope, he gave me the courage to believe in myself, to trust that even a girl like me, who had been so broken, could still fight for what was right. Together, we started researching, looking for any avenue that might give me a way to hold those who had abused me accountable. I didn't expect the system to be kind to me. In fact, I feared that it would be more of the same, a game of power and politics where the truth didn't matter. But I also knew that if I didn't try, if I didn't step forward and demand justice, then nothing would change. Not for me, and not for the other girls who had been left behind in the shadows. We started small, reaching out to organizations that worked with survivors of abuse. At first, it felt like a distant dream, talking to people who seemed so far removed from the life I had lived. But slowly, I found allies. There were lawyers who listened to my story, social workers who cared enough to help me navigate the labyrinth of bureaucracy, and journalists who were willing to investigate cases like mine, cases that were often ignored or buried. For the first time, I realized that there were people who didn't just want to help. They wanted to change the system that had allowed people like Congressman Myers to continue their exploitation unchecked. One of the first steps we took was to gather evidence. Jeremy and I spent months compiling every scrap of information I had from my time at the brothel. I went through every conversation, every encounter, every detail I could remember. The names of the men who had come to the brothel, the times they had been there, the illegal deals they had made, the abuse they had perpetrated, it was all in my head, waiting to be used. And I began to realize that I had a power that I had never acknowledged before, the power of my own story. The truth, no matter how painful, was something they could not take away. Jeremy and I went through my memories like a detective sifting through clues, piecing together a case, one that might never have been possible if I had kept silent. But speaking out came with its own dangers. I had to carefully consider every decision because I knew that if I was not careful, the men who had controlled my life could easily destroy me again. But this time I had something they didn't, allies who were willing to stand by me. In the midst of all of this, I had moments of doubt. I questioned whether this fight for justice was worth it. Could I really bring down such powerful people? Would my voice ever matter in a world where money and influence could silence the truth? But with each new step forward, each conversation with the lawyer, each piece of evidence we uncovered, I realized that I was no longer that frightened, hopeless girl trapped in the brothel. I had become someone who demanded to be heard. I had a voice and I was going to use it. The road to justice was long and the challenges were many. But the more I learned about the system, the more I realized that the struggle wasn't just about me. It was about the women who had been silenced, the girls whose lives had been destroyed, and the future of those who would come after us. As I began to understand the complexities of the justice system, I knew that we had a chance, however slim, of holding these powerful men accountable. But the system wasn't going to make it easy. We had to be relentless, we had to be patient, and most importantly, we had to be brave. The fight was only just beginning. And with every step, I was ready to take it. When I first walked out of the wreckage of the Nightflower Inn, I didn't know where to go. I had nothing, no family, no real documents, no money. What I had was my story, my voice, and the fire inside me that refused to let me be forgotten. In the years that followed, I realized that survival alone wasn't enough. I wanted to be someone who could help other women like me, who could stand up for those whose voices have been silenced by abuse and injustice. But the path to becoming that person was one I could never have imagined back when I was just a scared girl trying to survive each day. The transformation I underwent wasn't just physical, it was deep within my soul. For the first time in my life, I was no longer defined by the pain I had suffered. I realized that I had the power to redefine myself, to change the course of my life. But in order to do that, I knew I had to take control of my future. And that meant education, something I had once thought was an impossible dream. It all started with a decision I made one evening, sitting in the small room of the boarding house where Jeremy and I had found refuge. I had spent so many nights thinking about my past, about the girls I had left behind, and about the world I had just escaped from. And one night, the thought came to me, if I wanted to make a difference, if I truly wanted to help others like me, I needed to become someone who could fight the system, someone who could change it. And that meant becoming a lawyer. At first, the idea seemed almost absurd. How could a girl like me, who had been trapped in a brothel for so many years, ever become a lawyer? I had no education, no resources, and no connections. But I had something else, a determination that ran deeper than anything I had ever felt before. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that I could make it, that I could go beyond surviving to actually building a new life. So I began to plan. The first step was finishing my education. With the help of the Mothers Group and a few supportive friends, I enrolled in night school. I started by completing my high school diploma, a task that seemed daunting at first. I was much older than the other students, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I had a purpose now, something to strive for. I studied late into the night, after my work as a cashier, reading everything I could get my hands on. And slowly I began to see progress. I was learning again, and more than that, I was starting to believe in myself. It wasn't easy. There were nights when exhaustion weighed heavily on me, when the memories of my past threatened to pull me back into the darkness. But every time I sat down with my textbooks, every time I solved a problem, I felt a little more in control of my future. I realized that my past didn't have to define me, it could be a part of my story, but it didn't have to be the whole story. The more I learned, the more I understood the power that knowledge held. Jeremy, as always, was my biggest supporter. He had worked tirelessly to help support us as I studied, and his belief in me never wavered. He encouraged me when I felt discouraged and celebrated each small victory along the way. "You've got this, Annie," he'd say with that quiet confidence. "You're stronger than you think." After finishing high school, I applied to law school. It felt like a huge step, a leap into the unknown. I was nervous, unsure of whether I could handle it, but I knew I had to try. And try I did. I poured myself into my studies, determined to prove that I could succeed. The challenges were many, being much older than my classmates, juggling work and school, and dealing with the constant shadows of my past, but each obstacle made me more determined. I had come so far, and I wasn't about to stop now. In 1982, after years of hard work and perseverance, I graduated from law school. The feeling of holding that diploma in my hands was surreal. I had done it. I had taken control of my life and transformed myself into someone who could now fight for justice, not just for myself, but for others. My journey from the broken girl in the brothel to a woman who held the power of the law in her hands felt like a miracle, but it was a miracle I had built with my own two hands. After graduation, I was ready to take the next step in my journey. My dream wasn't just to be a lawyer, it was to use my experiences to change the very system that had allowed people like me to suffer. But the road ahead was still not without its challenges. There were doubts, setbacks, and moments when I questioned whether the system was too broken to fix. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't done. I had started a new life, and now it was time to use my new purpose to help those who couldn't help themselves. And that was just the beginning of the next chapter in my life. Looking back on my life, it's hard to recognize the girl I was all those years ago, the girl who entered the night flower and with nothing but fear in her heart, the girl who thought she had no future. That girl was broken, bruised by the world and by the men who used her. But today, I see strength where there once was only pain. I see resilience where there was once only hopelessness. The journey from then to now wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. There were moments when I thought I couldn't go on, when the weight of my past seemed too heavy to bear. But every time I faced another obstacle, another challenge, I reminded myself that I had survived. I had made it through the worst parts of my life, and now I had the chance to not just survive, but to thrive. One of the greatest lessons I've learned along the way is the power of resilience. It's not just about surviving your circumstances, it's about choosing to rise above them, to refuse to be defined by the worst things that have happened to you. Life can be cruel, it can be unforgiving, but you have the power to take control of your own narrative. You can transform your pain into purpose, your scars into strength. Another lesson I carry with me is the importance of giving others a voice, especially those who have been silenced by shame or fear. I've had the privilege of working with so many women over the years, hearing their stories and helping them find the strength to speak their truth. Every time someone shares their story, whether it's in a courtroom or in a quiet conversation, it's like breaking the chains that have kept them trapped. And that's something I never take lightly. That's why I decided to share my own story. For years I kept my past locked away, thinking it was too painful to revisit. But I've learned that telling your story, sharing it with others, is one of the most powerful ways to heal. When you speak up, you not only give yourself the chance to heal, you also give others the courage to do the same. And that's why I'm here today telling my story to all of you. I don't share it for sympathy, but because I want other women, other survivors, to know that it's possible to rebuild your life, no matter how broken it may seem. As I sit here now in my peaceful home, watching my grandchildren grow up in a world that, while still imperfect, offers them more protection and opportunity than I ever had, I can't help but feel a sense of peace. I have been able to transform my past into something that can help others, and that's a legacy I never thought possible. It's a legacy that I hope will inspire others to find the strength to rise above their circumstances and fight for a better future. But even with all that I've accomplished, I know there's more to do. There are still so many stories to be told, so many people who need help, and so much work left to be done. My journey may have come a long way, but there are still battles to fight, battles that I will continue to face for the rest of my life. And with each step forward, I'll keep sharing my story, hoping that it will inspire others to find their own strength, just as I did.